So James, James Ackman, Ackland, so apologies, James. James Ackland will be presenting today on the neighborhood effects, effects of voter choice on voter choice. Fascinating topic. I'm really looking forward to this. James is a postdoc at Glasgow University, where he works at the geoscience department. He is passionate about political geography, where a lot of his focus is spent there. And he also works on currently working on a new project on AI in elections, which is something we're also very interested in learning more about in the future, possibly a future presentation by James. Um, without further ado, over to you, James.
Thanks very much. That was a very kind introduction. I probably don't need to don't need to give my name and my position, but here it is on the slides anyway. So yeah, I'm James, I'm postdoc at the University of Glasgow. I'm going to talk today about neighbourhood effects, which probably maybe an unfamiliar term, I would guess. In some ways, quite a sort of esoteric, small corner of the academic literature, the political science literature. But I think in a way that very relevant to campaigning and hopefully therefore of interest to Campaign Lab and to people on this call. And hopefully something that will make more sense than than a kind of academic sounding name by the end of this. Um, just before I get started, if you get bored while I'm talking, which has been known to happen in the past, then as Douglas mentioned, I'm involved in a new collaboration around AI and elections. One thing we really want to know about is how people are using AI-based tools for campaigns or AI-based projects. A very broad definition of AI, a very broad definition of campaign elections. So if you think you might be doing anything that's even vaguely resembling this sort of work, please scan this QR code or go to this link and fill in our quick anonymous survey while we're doing it. I know being asked to do surveys is really boring, but we would really value any kind of feedback we can get on that at this early stage. So I'll leave this QR code up for the next few slides. That's a good idea. I just seen that in the chat that I could paste it in. Let me see if I can do that because I don't want to miss I don't want to miss any possible responses. Uh, no, but that's the Luma link. You don't want that. You want the this.
I can do that for you, James.
There you go. I think that's it. Okay, right. So having got my sort of self-promotion out the way or promotion of that project. So I think the way to come at this question is from this question of what causes a vote. And I think that in is kind of at the heart of what political scientists and campaigners and activists have in common is a desire to understand uh, why people vote the way that they do, which is the subtitle of my PhD supervisor's excellent book, What's Your Bias? Um, that PhD was in a psychology department, so I used to think about this in a psychological sense. And what I wrote about then was how sort of individual psychology might lead to vote behavior. And the idea is that if we understand, why people end up voting for a certain party, we might, as activists or campaigners, have a better chance then at changing that voting behavior if that's something we want to do, or identifying the people that we want to mobilize in a get out the vote campaign or what have you. So, like I say, my work took this approach of kind of individual psychology, trying to understand how people's beliefs, their morality, kind of properties of the individual lead them to vote choices. Um, but more kind of dominant in the political science literature is this idea of group psychology, um, in which kind of very visible demographic properties and groupings like your age, your gender, ethnicity, education, and so on are thought to be associated or can be shown to be associated with how you're going to vote. And foremost amongst these kind of theories is this idea called the Michigan model, which you might have come across if anyone's taken a political science class before. And within that is this idea, the funnel of causality, which is what's shown on the right here. And the idea of the funnel of causality is that voting behavior starts with these socio-demographics, with these social groups, and that early on in a voter's political journey, political life, they learn based on the social groups that they can see themselves as being a part of. They learn what we call a party identification, and that is essentially just the political party that best represents people like them in the kind of cultural consciousness. So, in its most kind of simplistic form, this comes from sort of 20, 30 years ago of American politics, where you can simply say working class voters vote for left-wing parties and middle class voters and upper class voters vote for right-wing parties. Now that gets more complicated in more recent years with more different kind of social groupings, cleavages, we call them in political science, becoming more salient. But that's the basic idea: is you start with social demographics, you learn your party ID, and once you know the party that you should identify with, in some sense, you can then process any kind of political events, campaign issues, candidates, policy positions, or controversies that come up later in your political life in line with your party ID. And you know that in general, if the candidate talking is from your party, you probably should agree with what most of what they have to say. If there's a scandal about a politician from another party, you probably think it's terrible. Now, clearly, this is a big generalization. There is scope for error. There is scope for deviation from the party line. This is not meant to be a kind of purely deterministic model of voting behavior, but the kind of insight that it does embed is that most of the voting process starts with sociodemographics, and this is a very influential way of thinking within political sciences. And it's spilled out political science and academia as well into more applied kind of cases. Perhaps most obviously is the idea of MRP polling. So this is probably a technology that will be familiar to some, but not to others. So I'll run through broadly how it works. So MRP polling is a way of doing opinion polling ahead of an election that's become very popular over the last 10 years or so. I think the first MRP poll in the UK, at least, was in 2017, run by YouGov. And by the 2024 election, there were at least 10 different pollsters using this methodology. So it's in kind of electoral politics timelines, it's grown relatively quickly. And the way that MRP polling works is a little bit different to a conventional poll. So conventionally, you go out and you ask what you hope to be a representative group of people who they're going to vote for, and then you sum it all up, and that is the result that you expect to see. When you run an MRP poll, you do the same first stage. You go out and talk to people and try to talk to a representative set of people. But instead of counting up who they say they're going to vote for, you use that data set to learn or to train a regression classifier on the patterns in that data. So in this kind of cobbled together example in the bottom left here, the party that they're going to vote for is represented by the color of the smiley face, right? And the hat they're wearing is some sort of demographic. And so instead of saying, well, we have 4 green voters, 4 purple voters, so it's going to be even, we say what we've learned from this poll is that triangle-hatted voters tend to vote for the Green Party, semicircular-hatted voters tend to vote for the Purple Party. And the reason that that insight is more useful is we can then project that onto what we know about the country as a whole through things like the census. So if we look at these kind of fake constituencies in the middle here, you can see the one on the left has an equal number of triangle hats and semicircular hats. And so because we know this pattern, we can say that the people in this constituency are probably going to be fairly evenly balanced. It's going to be a marginal seat. And we don't need to ask all those people because we've learned it from the poll and we can apply it to them. So we can say we think this is going to be a marginal seat. Whereas this constituency on the right has a lot of semicircle hats and not very many triangle hats. So we think it's likely that the Purple Party is going to hold on to this seat. So that's the basic idea of how MRP polling works. You can run it across many more demographic variables in a much larger area. And when you do so, you might get to something like this set of 2024 constituency predictions on the right. This is an MRP poll that analysis, I suppose, that I ran. As you can see, I was very bullish on Labour's chances, or at least the data was very bullish on Labour's chances. I thought this was likely to be an overestimate, and indeed it was. But it gets more right than it tends to get wrong. And I think it's important for me to stress that at this stage that I think MRP polling is effective, and I think the theory underneath it is generally useful for understanding how people vote. It's important for me to say that because the rest of what I talk about today is going to be about the errors and what goes wrong when you think about politics in this very particular theory of voting that starts with demographics and builds everything up from there. And I think the reason it goes wrong is because it ignores two important properties of politics, two properties that academics and data nerds like myself are very good at forgetting about. The first of which is the real world. So, out in the real world, there is more to life than demographics, there is more to life than your data set. Um, I suspect that in this to this audience of sort of political junkies, you can look at these two pictures in the top right, the High Street in Dumfries, where I live, and Argyle Street, which is one of the main shopping streets in Glasgow, where I work. And you can probably tell from these photos which of these is taken in a staunchly Labour constituency and which of them is in one of the few Conservative voting seats in Scotland. And we know that from properties of the environment, right, without having to talk to people. And these semicircular hatted people that we have in both of these diagrams, you can imagine that the same person living in Glasgow or the same person living in Dumfries might vote in very different ways or have very different attitudes just because of the way in which they interact with their environment on a day-to-day basis. There are other properties of geography that matter for politics as well. So geographic identity is one that does sort of chime with that Michigan model, the demographic determinism view, because you can say that, for example, being Cornish or being Cumbrian or Mancunian or whatever is a part of your demographic identity, is something that you learn about yourself and you learn how people like that tend to vote. So that can be influential in voting behavior. We also know that geography is amplified and distorted in strange ways by the electoral system. I'm sure these plots in the bottom right will be familiar to some of you as different ways in which we can look at how an election has played out. So we can think about votes as being aggregated into real geographic areas. We can think about the representation that an election will lead to in Parliament. So that's that sort of hex map in the middle. Or we can look at this weird distorted population view map, which kind of tends to emphasize cities and emphasize where the people are effectively to tell you how kind of people rather than land has voted. And each of these views tells a slightly different story about how an election might have unfolded. And that in itself is a reflection of the way in which geography is kind of encoded in our elections. And then the final thing that happens in the real world that MRP doesn't quite know about are local issues, local history. So you can imagine that if you live in a constituency that, for example, has a where a large number of people are employed by a single industry, so maybe that's, I don't know, mining, or maybe there's a military base or that sort of thing, right? There are various constituencies that look like this around the country. Then the voters in that area are going to have a very specific set of incentives that differ from the national norm, right? So they're not necessarily going to be paying attention to the national campaign if they have one candidate in their constituency who is committed to closing down that employer, for example. And it doesn't need to be employment. There are other kind of contingencies and issues, or maybe it's a scandal, or maybe it's a kind of big organizing campaigning effort that can affect one constituency and pull it away from the national norm without affecting the kind of national discourse. So that's one way in which this kind of demographic determinism or Michigan model of voting can be wrong. Um, and it represents something like what we would call a neighborhood effect. The other way, the other thing that academics and data nerds aren't very good thinking about, or perhaps this is just talking about myself, is thinking about other people, right? And this is perhaps more conventionally what we mean when we talk about a neighborhood effect. It's the idea of whether we are persuaded in our voting behavior, in our politics, by our neighbors. So we have an undecided semicircle hat guy here. We'll remember that the semicircle hats generally voted for the Purple Party, but because his neighbors are all Green Party voters, they might be people that he interacts with fairly regularly. Does that make him more likely to vote for the Green Party than the Purple Party than he would be otherwise if he lived elsewhere? Or how will that affect his vote, I suppose? And there are four theoretical models for how this can work. So if you turn your attention to these little plots in the bottom right, these are all simulated data. This is not real data, but these are different ways in which a neighborhood effect might play out. And I've used the context of Scotland because I think it's always good to bring Scottish politics down to London. So it's a little bit technical, a little bit in the weeds, so I'll try to run through it bit by bit. So on the y-axis here, you have the SNP vote share for two different groups of voters, for the independence voters and for the no voters or the better together voters or whatever you want to call them. And on the x-axis along the bottom, you have the independence percentage of the constituency in which they live. So there are four cases as to how these things might interact. The first is that there might be no neighborhood effect. And this is what is implied by a demographic understanding of politics. And it says that if you're an independence voter, then you're very likely to vote for the SNP, regardless of where you live. And if you're an anti-independence voter, a unionist voter, you're very unlikely to vote for the SNP. And that's just true across the board, whichever constituency you live in, whether it's a low independence constituency or a high independence constituency. An alternative is what we would call a consensual neighborhood effect. So that's this top right plot. And here, what is happening is people are more likely to vote the way of their neighbors than they would be if they lived somewhere else. So to be a little more specific about that, you can see that the SNP vote share amongst unionist voters, that's the blue line, increases when they live in areas that have lots of nationalist or independence people around them. So they're learning from their neighbors, from the people they interact with, that it's kind of okay to vote SNP, and they're more likely to do so, even though they don't agree on this issue of independence. And conversely, independence voters, when they live in more unionist constituencies, are less likely to vote for the SNP than they would be otherwise. So that's one model, another model of how a neighborhood effect might work. The third is this idea of a reactive model, and this is basically the opposite, right? So this is the case where being a minority in your community or your neighborhood makes you even more unlikely or more entrenched in your beliefs, I guess. And this kind of chimes, I think, with the narratives around polarization that we tend to hear. And so in this case, if you're an independence voter and you're in a very unionist constituency and you see all these unionists all the time, it riles you up and you're even more likely to vote for the SNP than you would have been otherwise. And likewise, if you're a no voter, a unionist voter, and you're in a very pro-independence constituency, then you're even less likely to vote for the SNP and you're very keen to kind of stand by your ideals. And then the final possibility is this thing called a Przeworski effect. I've almost certainly butchered the pronunciation. And this is simply a case in which one group of people acts in a consensual manner and the other in a reactive manner. Again, very important to note this is simulated data. In this simulated data, the independence voters are acting consensually and the no voters are acting reactively. I'm not suggesting that that is actually how politics plays out in Scotland, but that's kind of what it would look like. So these are different ways in which a neighborhood might impact your vote. This is what a neighborhood effect kind of conventionally looks like. And you might think, this is all well and good, but is it actually very likely? I mean, do you really kind of learn politics just by walking past someone in the street or by having a conversation? Do you not think about politics in a deeper way than that? And that is the subject of, or was the subject of some debate when this stuff was first being kind of written about in the 70s and 80s. I think the mechanism by which these effects happen is not yet fully understood. But I think it's important to think about politics as a process of socialization. And in particular, if you think about the way in which we process information as humans, um, there's a whole field called sort of social cognition, which stresses the importance of uh, processing information in terms of its social context. And I think that might be what's going on here. That sure, you're not persuaded by an off chance meeting with your neighbor while you're mowing the grass, right? But if you talk about politics and talk about current affairs and political events with people of a certain political persuasion, then you will learn information through that filter and you will process information that you've learned in the ways that they like to think as a group as well. And so I think it is plausible that there is a mechanism here, and indeed, the literature does find that these consensual effects, where you vote more like the people around you, are the type for which there is the most evidence, at least kind of in this sort of 20 to whatever that is, 50 years ago. Um, Time frame, and mostly around social classes is what those analyses happen to focus on. But there is evidence for them, and they work in this consensual way. So this is the point at which some of my research finally appears. Um, I was interested while I was working in political psychology on whether you might characterize constituencies or neighborhoods by their psychological characteristics rather than social class or more sort of conventional demographics. I was very lucky to be working closely with Jason Renfro and colleagues who produced the data sets behind these lovely maps in the bottom left corner. So what these are aggregated psychological characteristics of different constituencies around the UK. And I won't go too deep into the sort of psychology theory of what these things are, but we have conscientiousness, which is related to sort of discipline and hard work and diligence and carefulness. We have openness, which is more about kind of curiosity, openness to experiences, new ideas. And we have right-wing authoritarianism, which is a more kind of explicitly political personality trait, which is related to a kind of willingness to submit to authority, to follow social norms, and also a level of kind of aggression or hostility against people that you have that you consider to be in an out group, other to you in some sense. And these map onto politics. These are known to map onto politics at the individual level. Um, what we wanted to understand was whether they might also operate at the neighborhood effect. And what we found, broadly speaking, was that openness and right-wing authoritarianism are quite individual level effects. They operate mostly kind of directly on you as an individual. But conscientiousness, there is evidence for a neighborhood effect. So what we show here is that if you live in an area where the people around you are very conscientious. Conscientiousness is associated with conservative voting, and you are therefore more likely to vote conservative than someone of an equivalent profile to you across all kinds of dimensions, including your own level of conscientiousness. You're more likely to vote conservative than that person if they lived somewhere else that had a lower level of conscientiousness nearby. So it kind of rubs off on you in some way and affects how you vote. Um, So that research that I was running came out of this kind of older tradition of detecting neighborhood effects, which starts with this idea of looking at local deviations in class alignment. So we thought we knew that working class people voted for Labour and middle class people voted for the Conservatives, and early researchers in this area found local deviations, found individuals who were working class and voting for the Conservatives or middle class and voting for Labour and wanted to understand if there was any pattern to where they were. And indeed, they found that there was. There was this consensual effect where the people who were voting for the wrong party in some sense were doing so at higher rates in areas where other people were voting for that party, in areas where they were minorities in that class. Um, you can see that this might lead to some fairly obvious pushback in terms of the other sorts of variables that might affect how you vote. And so through the 80s and 90s, there were these kind of increasingly complex and not particularly elegant regression models used to try to detect these effects. And sometime around the kind of early 2000s, it seems like everyone sort of lost interest in this idea, possibly because they just kind of pushed their computers about as far as they could go. Um, the only paper that I'm going to mention by name today is this one by Fotheringham and colleagues in 2021, because it was finding this paper that kind of permitted me to think, okay, maybe we can still do something on neighborhood effects. Their method is really nice. And so what they do is they have a big prediction model, which is a little bit like an MRP. It's not quite an MRP, but it's MRP-like. And from that, they take a bunch of demographic information and make predictions about how each, in this case, county in the US is going to vote in the presidential election. And then they make this prediction. They wait for the election. The election comes along, and they get the election results. And as you can see from these two maps, their predictions are really pretty good, right? Like there's a pretty good correlation here. But what they can do is they can subtract the election results from their prediction. And when they do so, what they get is the mistakes that their model made. And I think what's really nice about this paper is they, instead of saying these are the mistakes our model made, so these are wrong, they say these mistakes are where there's information that we can learn from. So it's called residuals in modeling, but it doesn't really the specifics don't matter so much. But what's clever, I think, is this idea of learning from the error. And what they say is if there's a gap between our well calibrated demographics model and what actually happens, then the only thing left to explain it is a context effect. It's not quite the same as saying it's a neighborhood effect. It's not the same level of specificity that early work was trying to reach, but it's far more kind of applicable to the real world. Once you do it, you just know, we can go and look at these areas, and maybe we find something really weird going on there, and we can ignore it. But this is a kind of quick and dirty way, maybe not quick and dirty, it's quite quite complicated analysis that goes into it, but you don't need to really specifically identify a neighborhood effect in order to know that there's something going on contextually. Um, so if you want to go and read a paper after this, then that would be the one to read. So I took this idea because I thought it was great and applied it to my own MRP. So I didn't bring that up at the start just to point out how rubbish my own modeling was. It does come back here. So I took my own MRP prediction. I had a look at where the kind of nationwide errors were. So we can see that I was very overconfident about Labour, underconfident about Conservatives. I think I was about right on Reform. You can subtract all of those nationwide errors, and then you look at the results and see where there were overperformances. So that's what this map in the bottom right is showing is the party that we overestimated the most or that underperformed its polling in some sense the most per constituency, and the sort of brightness of the color is the size of the overestimate. Um, and it's a bit of a patchwork. I mean, there's not so much that you can see. It seems like the SNP in general, we overestimated them in the borders and in the north of Scotland, and they did better than expectations in the central belt. But as you move down to England, it's a kind of patchwork of various colours. But what we can then do is zoom in on the constituencies where there were big neighbourhood effects, with really large errors. And what we see is that in the three largest neighborhood effects, the three largest context effects in 2024, were all pro-Gaza independents running against Labour candidates and essentially taking away Labour votes. So that's in Bradford West, Bethnal Green, Stepney, and Islington North. That these are almost 20-point swings away from the expectation for Labour towards a pro-Gaza independent. And so we can see from this data that there's this group, this political group were very effective at identifying constituencies in which they were going to be able to take away votes from kind of where we might expect them to go and provide themselves with some political representation in very specific areas around the country. Similar kind of candidate effects, I guess you could say, exist with a Reform candidate who withdrew in Wales, and the Speaker seat, which is always going to be a bit weird. But then a little further down, but still large effects, right? These are almost 15 percentage point swings relative to our expectation. These are the more kind of traditional neighborhood effects. So this is where we think there was a big organizing effort, or in the case of Orkney and Shetland, there's a kind of strong tradition there of the Liberal Democrats being the kind of uh, default party in some sense, I guess. So even though it's a constituency that looks like it ought to vote quite strongly for the SNP, it actually, for kind of historically contingent neighborhoody reasons, votes for the Liberal Democrats. Um, and just for fun, I found also what the constituency with the smallest effect was. So this is the kind of most normie constituency, if you like. South Derbyshire pretty much went exactly as we expected. So if you want to learn what your kind of true, authentic political preference is, then I guess our analysis suggests you should move to South Derbyshire, and you'll find out what the what the least affected version of your politics might be. Okay. So what does all of this mean for campaigning and for elections? Well, to be honest, that's kind of what I hope you guys can tell me, that you guys are the experts in campaigning. Um, but my takeaway is to think about this in terms of what other academics tend to say about campaigns. I've picked out a kind of selection of papers here that are pretty skeptical, I would say, of the effectiveness of campaigning, the effectiveness of voter persuasion. And I think that is maybe not widespread, but certainly a view that exists within academia. And I think it is in some way coming from this background of thinking about demographics as the way in which people vote. And I don't want to say that these papers are wrong because they're not. Demographics do drive a lot of how we vote. They're very telling. Those MRP models are really good. But demographics are not destiny. There are cases in which you can have fairly substantial swings away from expectation. And sometimes that seems to be caused by organizing, by campaigning, by understanding in detail the context in which a specific race or a specific seat is being competed. And so I think if you're a campaigner listening to this, which I guess pretty much by definition most of you are, then the takeaway, I think, is that spending time firstly identifying constituencies that have these groups of people that might not vote the way that a traditional model thinks they will is a very good use of your time. And once you've found those constituencies, you want to go and understand why they're different to the national conversation and what it is that you can say to people that they will understand in a kind of local context that might be able to swing them away from the national conversation, which, as an individual campaigner, unless there's anyone here from kind of Labour HQ, you probably don't have that much say over how that kind of level of discourse is going to go. So, yeah, like I say, I'd really love to hear anyone else's thoughts on how this applied to campaigning as well. So I think we'll open up for questions shortly. I will just once again plug that QR code, that survey, for a different bit of work. Although, like Douglas said, I might be back to talk about it at a later stage. That is work on how AI and very broadly defined AI tools might affect the elections of the future. If you're building anything that looks even slightly like that, we really want to hear about it. We really want to hear from you to understand how those sorts of tools might shape elections in the very near future. There's a bunch of contact details for me if you want to get in touch, other than to ask me a question. Thanks very much.
Thanks, James. I see, Nyasha, you've had your hand up for a while. Do you want to go first?
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating and appreciative of this space. Apologies for the lack of camera. So I may have missed something, but we'd just love to hear your thoughts. You spoke about context, of course. So when it comes to things like first past the post, etc., shy Tory syndrome, this, and just general things around, whether people really sort of, might speak with their neighbours about politics with any depth in terms of actually being sort of declarative of I'm going to sort of vote this way. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then also how you think this features in, say, for example, a constituency like Carshalton and Wallington.
You might have to fill me in on the specifics of that constituency. I suspect there's some electoral context there that I don't know. But to the first point, at least, about the sort of plausibility of people talking about politics in their day-to-day lives. I think it's really important that as very politically engaged people, politically involved people, we remember that almost no one else is like this, right? And other people, normal people, whatever they might be, don't think about politics every waking hour. And I think that mistake, repeated kind of over and over again, explains quite a lot of what we get wrong. Um, and so in that sense, I think you're right to be skeptical if I'm detecting that correctly, skeptical about the idea that these neighborhood effects work by people saying, I'm going to vote for XYZ, and then you happen to hear that as you walk out of your front door and you go, oh great, I'll do that too. That's not, I don't think, how this works. I think it's this idea of kind of deeper political socialization and learning political facts in a social context that has a bunch of biases. And if you think about a lot of the way we talk about online discourse, I think embeds these kinds of ideas, right? The idea of echo chambers is sort of the online equivalent of this in some way, that a person can end up in a space where the people around them think about politics in a particular way, perhaps an unusual way, and that can shape the way that new facts, new information about the political sphere is integrated into their worldview in such a way that they might end up reflecting their neighbours, reflecting their peers, more than perhaps their demographic characteristics might suggest. Does that sort of answer the question?
Sorry, I stepped away. And yes, that's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Looks like there's a few more hands up. I didn't see who was up first, but I can see Den Howlett is the first on my screen. So
Go.
Hi there. Could you just go back to the slide where you were showing all those differences? You had Bradford West at the top and Cardiff East at the bottom. I'm just trying to understand what the difference is between those two. The reason for that is because I live a couple of constituencies away from Bradford West, so I'm somewhat interested in how that lot's going on, given that we've got all out elections coming in May for our
this,
councillors.
am I on the right slide here?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this table in the middle, which I think is what you're,
That's
excuse me,
correct. Yes.
referring to. So this is the using the method, or a method derived from what Fotheringham and colleagues did. This is what we think the list of constituencies with the greatest neighborhood effects
Okay.
in 2024 was, right?
Okay.
And we're defining neighborhood effects here quite broadly as basically deviation from what you would expect based on the types of people who live there.
Okay.
And in Bradford West, our model predicts a really strong Labour vote, and I think is basically right to do so because in the past it's a strongly Labour voting constituency as far as I'm aware. But because
Yep.
of the presence of a high-profile independent candidate in 2024, the Labour Party underperforms by 20 points. So, or the error here is Labour plus 20, underperform minus 20. You know, you can sort of
Okay.
slice it either way, right? So that's what we're saying is going on. These explanations, by the way, are just like me trying to make sense of what I think has happened in that election. So these are not, there's no kind of data behind the explanation column, but this is the list of the most kind of deviant, I suppose, in some sense, constituencies from expectations. So we think certainly these ones that I've highlighted in pink are kind of candidate effects or effects of the specific race that was playing out. And that can cut both ways, right? Uh, that might be because that might purely be an effect of having a weird set of candidates, but it might also be that these
Mhm.
constituencies are being targeted by, for example, these pro-Gaza independent candidates because they know that there's they have some understanding, right, of this being a likely place that they'll be able to do well.
Is there any significance in the choice of your colouring in pink at the top and green at the bottom?
Not in the choice of colors. That's just to differentiate what I'm thinking of as being kind of candidate effects in pink from more sort of traditional neighborhood effects in green. And then there's a few weird ones. So Manchester Soma, I actually don't know how you say that, Russian maybe, has the lowest turnout in the country. That probably causes the model to be a bit unhappy. And Dundee Central, I could not figure out for the life of me why the SNP did so badly in Dundee Central. They still won the seat, just. So it's not like there's any kind of big postmortems out there because they got their candidate. But they underperformed really badly, and it's not super clear to me why. If anyone knows, if anyone's from Dundee Central, I'd really love to hear about it because yeah, I was like, am I gonna have to leave that as a question mark in my presentation? And yeah, I have in the end. But yes, not too
So
much
just
work.
just to follow on, sorry, just to follow on from that. As I say, we have all-out elections here in my district, Bradford district, and we're looking to elect 90 councillors. Okay, and and we obviously have a fair idea what our opposition looks like in some senses, but like I imagine other people on this call, we're deeply concerned about the potential impact of Reform UK. Right now, everything that I have seen so far, particularly online, suggests to me that that particular party is purely playing a national game and throwing around the usual tropes that we see. And it strikes me that the most effective way of being able to combat that, and in other words, address your neighbourhood effects thing, is to be local and hyper local in our approach to residents and voters. Does that fit with your theory of how you're looking at things?
Yes and no. So I think
Okay.
it does in the sense that that is, I think, in my understanding, and I'm not a campaigner, right? I sit in my office and kind of look at spreadsheets, right? But in my understanding of what a campaigner does, I think that's the right strategy because that's what is kind of within your control. And what I'm saying here is that doing that can be effective under the right circumstances, and you can see really big effects where one constituency, under the conditions of big organising efforts, something like Edinburgh North and Leith, really diverges from the national norm. That being said, the demographic picture sort of is what it is, and it does explain a lot of voting behavior. So if you're
Okay.
in an area where there are lots of people who look like they're likely to vote reform, a lot of them are going to vote reform, right?
Yeah.
But yes, I think from a campaigning perspective, uh, I think using local issues to your advantage and really understanding the neighborhood in which you're operating is likely to be a more effective route than trying to change demographics. I guess is the takeaway I would give from this because that's where there's more sort of play that you might be able to make.
Brilliant.
I think there's a hand up from Rich.
Hi there, it's Rich Spear from Unison and Cymru region. Really interested in whether you know of or whether you've seen any effects in elections that aren't run under first past the post electoral system, whether that has different impact in terms of local campaigning based on the differences in the electoral systems. Obviously, we're moving to a very large constituency, the system at the upcoming election, which is very different than I think any other election that's really been in the UK before. Whether this method has been applied in more proportional systems and how local effects work, say in a much more kind of strict proportional representation system, or whether the effect is lessened. Because obviously we've got this scenario where the sixth seat in because the six seats in 16 constituencies where the sixth seat is what's marginal,
Mhm.
basically, is where an effect of a campaign might be seen. Um, like understanding that dynamic and how the modeling and polling might either be really more accurate or a lot less accurate because these systems haven't been played out in reality before, and whether that has an effect on the models. Just interested in your perspective on that, really.
Yeah, certainly from a modeling perspective, I feel quite confident in saying confident in saying that we're not confident. Models, in my experience, are almost always derived from first past the post systems, basically from America, and there's also a British tradition as well. Um, And so they tend to, it's more complicated, right, to model a non first past the post election, unless you have something like a single list system where it's literally just the percentage. That's very easy. But as soon as you have something like an additional member system in Scotland or runoffs or any of this sort of stuff, it becomes hugely more complex. So you probably should not expect polls to be accurate in terms of, as accurate when they give you a forecast of seats at least. Forecast of voting preferences should still be relatively good, at least insofar as people aren't thinking about the electoral system when they vote. So from a modeling perspective, yeah, I think you're probably right to wonder whether polls are going to tell you as much in a new context, especially if you're moving to a new electoral system as well. Then you don't have the benefit of previous data that you can train a model on, which will make things tricky and basically just more uncertain across the board. So it might be that it's more than just the one seat that's kind of at play because we just don't have as good of a sense of what the underlying dynamics are. As to whether a neighborhood effect is greater under those conditions, I don't know. I'm not aware of any research comparing the scale of neighborhood effects under proportional representation to first past the post. Um, I can sort of see it going either way, in that, under proportional representation, you have these kind of more local dynamics where you might I'm thinking about like the regional lists that we have in Scotland where like the way in which if you want to vote tactically, your incentives are very different depending on which region your constituency happens to land in. But I can also see that generally proportional representation can be more nationalizing, in that sometimes it's just a bit overwhelming for voters to understand what's going on. So they might be more inclined to just kind of go with their gut in some sense rather than try and get too cute with it. Yeah, I wouldn't like to say for sure whether neighborhood effects are kind of more or less significant under those conditions, but it's certainly possible that it's different, which is probably not a super helpful thing for me to say.
No,
But
it's
yeah,
interesting though. Thanks.
I don't see any more hands, but there might be some. I don't know if.
I have a question in the meantime. Um, you mentioned there are profiles of areas like a typical Labour area or typical SNP area. Um, where can I assume that these profiles exist somewhere. Where can we access these
Um,
profiles to get an idea of what these typical areas might look like and what factors you compiled and put into these profiles?
Yeah, great question. I meant I meant profiles in kind of the abstract sense that there's a stereotype profile of what a labor area might look like. That being said, I know so it is possible to do kind of clustering analyses or that sort of thing to get different ideas of how different constituencies sort of look. And I'm pretty sure electoral calculus have something like this. They have some way of characterizing constituencies, both in terms of their voting behavior and in terms of the kind of um, sort of voter groups or ideological groups that might be dominant in certain areas. I'm sure there will be other tools and other efforts out there that have done similar sorts of analyses. It's also something I've thought about in the past as being a way to potentially improve MRP models that you might be able to bring in a bit of that sense, not so much of neighborhood effects, but of neighborhood, for want of a more academic word, vibe into your model to say this is, this constituency in I don't know wherever it is in Falkirk or somewhere in Scotland might look very much like this constituency way down in the southwest of England. They're not geographically close to each other, but they have lots of similar properties. They profile in a similar way, and so they might be likely to sort of swing in the same direction. So those sorts of tools do exist. I haven't developed any of them myself, but yeah, like I say, electoral calculus I think is one place that does them. I'm sure there's more.
I got a bit of a lead-on question there. I mean, how easy would it be to get or compile this data on an even more localized level, say even a street level, city block level, or a road group level, ideally for organizing, because you could foresee that this could be quite a useful tool might be able to be created out of this at a road group level for on the ground sort of practical purposes.
Yeah, so I was very keen when I was running this work to try to get down to a lower geography level. There are two reasons why that's hard to do. One of them is just to do with the sheer volume of data that you need. So in order to kind of accurately characterize any unit, you want to have a good number of responses. Rule of thumb is sort of 20 to 30 um, to really get a good sense of it. There are various tools, kind of smoothing tools, for example, that can kind of reduce those constraints a little bit. But generally, if you want more fine-grained analysis, you have more units, and so you need more raw data to begin with. So just the volume is one problem, and then the other is kind of data privacy concerns. It's very difficult to get access to open data at anything lower than a parliamentary constituency level uh, in terms of like survey responses. If you want to use someone else's survey, if you run your own survey, then obviously you can. I mean, I don't want to say you can do what you want, right? Because that's not very ethics forward of me. But you have more control, I suppose, over what type of data you collect. Um, but yeah, from a kind of open data perspective, it's tricky. The census data is available at lower resolutions. That can be quite useful. I've got some work at the moment that looks at the level of council wards in Scotland using census data. But obviously that doesn't tell you who people are voting for. So that's the kind of trade-off. But yeah, in theory, it's possible. I mean, if you happen to have really good friends at YouGov, then I know they collect the way that you give them your constituency is to tell them your postcode, right? So they do know. They just aren't going to tell you. They aren't going to publish that because it's kind of GDPR problems.
Thank you so much, James. I think we have time for one more question, and then I will launch the survey. Anyone got any other questions? You can either raise your hand and give it verbally or put it in the chat. In the meantime, is there anything else you want to sort of add that you felt you haven't mentioned, and anything that you feel might be of practical use from these insights for organizers like ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's always tricky. I think as from sitting in a kind of academic seat to try and suggest what people who are actually doing real work ought to be doing, right? But I think the utility of these kind of big data tools to begin to uncover really low-level local insights is something that you don't want to overlook. It's something that I suspect uh, um, well, not to presume the partisan lean of Campaign Lab, but I suspect your opponents will be using kind of quite large scale uh, data analytics in various ways to understand what's going on and how to translate that to activism at the sort of street by street level. And I think it can be quite tempting to look at the errors in something like MRP polling, the errors in I see this in like um, in comments underneath, YouGov polls all the time. People will say like, "Oh, your MRP poll has my constituency going to the Lib Dems," but they never win there, and I know this because I live there. And I always I want to reply to that and scream like, "That's the point. That's the whole thing, right? Is that you understand something about your local area that the model doesn't, and you can learn from that misunderstanding. It's not That's not proof that the model is bad. The model isn't usually bad. The model is generally speaking pretty good. But if you know something that the model doesn't, that isn't in the model's input data because it doesn't live in the real world, then you should do something with that information. You should go and use it in activism rather than shouting at YouGov because YouGov don't care. I think would be my take on that. I feel like I've almost slandered YouGov in this call. I think as far as I'm aware, they're lovely people. I know some of them. They do great work.
Thanks, James. It's a fantastic insight. Yeah, and yes, I have no doubt that there are many, many wonderful people at YouGov too. Um, I'm going to launch a poll now, so if everyone can just stick around quickly, just to please fill in the poll. There are 11 of us, well, 10 of us, minus myself, who's launching the poll. So please take a few seconds just to fill it out. We've got one response, two responses so far. Um, three, four responses, five, six responses, seven, almost there, eight. I'll stop at 9 or 10. Um, one more, but let's see if we can squeeze one more poll response out and then call it a day. And I think that's it. That's everyone. Um, cool. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, James.
Thank
This
you.
was a fantastic presentation. I think we can all agree on that. Um, uh, like I said, next time, 26th of February will be our next presentation on the why young people vote for the right. Um, See you all then, and we will put all this into a blog post, which we'll share on our mailing list, and I'll upload this video to YouTube. Cool. Thank you so much.